Hey, this is Eli for MOBOXgraphics.com. In this tutorial we are going to model a low poly tree in Cinema 4D and add some animation to it. Low poly stands for low polygon, and a polygon is a flat shape built out of straight lines, and all those polygons combined create a three-dimensional object. So with this technique we use as less of these as possible, which will make it look more abstract and simple if you want to call it like that. But it is also easier on the computer and also a great way to start off with 3D modeling. If this is the first time you're using Cinema 4D, I recommend quickly looking into the basics first, but assuming you know these already, let's jump straight into Cinema 4D. So let's start off with creating a cylinder, and let's also set our display settings to constant shading lines, so it is easier to see where the polygons are. Up here let's also delete the Phong tag. This tag automatically smooths out the polygon's edges, but it kind of looks weird when you're really modeling in a low poly style, so let's delete it for now. Now let's decrease our rotation segments of the cylinder down here, and 8 is a great number for a tree trunk. Working with 4 sides, which is a cube, is easier, but it doesn't look as good. So let's keep it at 8. Now make this object editable by pressing C on the keyboard. And when we are in the polygon mode, select the ones on the top. And when we press D on the keyboard now, we can extrude the polygons by clicking and dragging. Let's also move these to the side a little bit, because real trees are rarely perfectly straight either. Now if we rotate these, we can start extruding again in a nice angle. And it's basically repeating those steps until you get a nice trunk. Obviously you rarely get the perfect result at your first try, so when you select the rectangle selection tool, with the only select visible elements option deselected, and then go in the point mode, you can select every segment and move it around until you're satisfied. To create branches, we will need to add polygons to our trunk. To do this, go in the polygon mode and press K on the keyboard to select the knife tool, and then press L to make it a loop cut. If we make a cut somewhere about here, we have some nice new polygons to extrude into a branch. Select one of these new polygons and press K again, but this time press K once more to make it a line cut. Now you can make cuts at the corners until we get an octagonal shape again, so a shape with 8 sides. When we select this newly created polygon again, we can start extruding it like we did for the trunk. And for the first extrusion I usually like to make it really short and scale it down a little bit, so it kind of makes the connection to the tree softer. And let's repeat those steps to create a couple more branches, and don't forget to keep on zooming out every so often so you can check if the tree looks realistic in proportions. The long and heavy branches are always at the bottom, and the smaller branches usually branch off at the end of a bigger branch, so that kind of gives you an idea of how you can make this tree. But it all really depends on what kind of tree you're trying to make. Most of the times it looks better when you slightly exaggerate the overall feel of a real tree. So think about how you would describe the tree. Is it a strong and lively tree, or is it slanted and dynamic? And once you're somewhat satisfied with your tree trunk, we can start adding the tree crowns. These are also very important to describe the overall feel of your tree. But for the sake of this tutorial, we are going to stick with a more regular tree that could fit in most of your scenes. So to do this, let's create a new platonic object and set the type to buggy. Scale it and move it roughly so it fits at the top of the tree, and then make the object editable again by pressing C, and now you can scale it down vertically so it isn't as round anymore, it's kind of squished together now. To modify this shape some more, let's add a melt object to it. Let's drag it on top of the platonic object, and you'll see it really melted a lot right now. When we change the strength to something like 4%, you'll get most of the shape back again. From here it's mostly playing around by moving the melt object up or down and scaling it until you get a nice shape. After that we can start duplicating the platonic shape again, which will also duplicate the melt object which is inside of it, and make some random adjustments to the scaling, the rotation and the position itself. Don't hesitate to further adjust the tree trunk as well, so it nicely connects to the crowns. Up here you see the branch is a little bit too simple and straight, so let's make a loop cut on it and move it down a little bit so we have a nice curve in the branch. As a next step, we are going to add a floor to the scene. Position it so it slightly overlaps the bottom of the tree. And on the tree we are going to create a new loop cut so we can put the roots in an angle. If we select the bottom polygons and scale them, you will notice they are not connected to the tree itself. So instead of selecting these polygons, let's go into the point mode and select all the bottom points. And now when you scale these, they will stay connected to the whole tree. To enhance the look of the roots, you can select one of these polygons and extrude it and just move them under the floor. Next up, let's spice up our scene with some little details like rocks and grass. For the rocks, we are going to create a new platonic object and set it to 2 segments. This is so we have more points to manipulate the shape. Move the object so it sinks in the ground and make it editable again. Now the fun part kind of starts. When we are in either our polygon or point mode, right click in the viewport and select the brush. You can adjust the brush size holding your middle mouse button and now gently start brushing over the shape. Don't overdo it because you'll get some nasty pointy edges and doesn't look as good. But to add some more variation, let's also add a second platonic object and set it to the type octa, with 2 segments again. Repeat the same steps as with the previous rock, but try making it look a little different, and it looks good as a smaller rock in this case. Great, so now let's add a low poly version of grass. There are some ways to get more realistic looking grass in Cinema 4D, but it is also very slow to render and it takes a lot of skill to make it look good, and it wouldn't even fit the scene overall because we are working in this low poly style. So instead, create a new pyramid shape and make it really tall and pointy, and then scale it down so it's the size of grass. You can duplicate this object by just copying and pasting it, or you can move the object while holding Ctrl or Command on the keyboard and it will automatically duplicate it for you to that position. Let's scale this one down a little bit more. And for variation's sake, we are going to add a third one, which is just between those sizes. Okay, so now we've got our base models of the smile details, but we would like to create more of these that are all scattered over the floor. Personally, I'm one of the guys that likes to do this manually, so I have a perfect control over how it looks. But it can get quite time consuming if you need many of these. So let's clone these instead by going up here to the MoGraph menu and picking the cloner object. Then drag all these rocks and pyramids inside of the cloner. And down here in the cloner properties, set the mode to object. This means the object will be distributed over another object we picked for it. But we don't have this object already, so let's create a new plane and move it just under the floor so we can't see it. Now let's scale it up so it covers the area where we would like to see some grass and rocks. And now go back into the cloner properties and drag the plane object on top of the object field of our cloner. Now we can set the distribution to surface, and we also want to deselect the align clone option so that grass isn't laying flat. Down here you can enter how many objects you want there to be, and you could also adjust the seed number to replace the objects randomly. But to have more control over this, we want to add a random effector, which you can find under the MoGraph tab again. If we scroll down, we can also turn on the scale and rotation options, and from here it's mostly playing with the values until we get something nice looking. But for the scale, make sure to check uniform scale, so it scales evenly, and for the rocks and grass we also only want them to rotate on the H-axis so it doesn't go upside down or something. Also, with this technique it's really easy to adjust our base models, and Cinema 4D will automatically update all those clones for us. So this is a huge time saver compared to the manual method. Now let's also play around with the cloner seed so we get something nice looking. But there are a little bit too many rocks for my liking, so you can fix this by adding more pyramids in the cloner group. So let's duplicate some of these and play around with the seed number again until it looks just fine. Obviously you can also combine this cloner method with the manually placed objects, so let's duplicate some of the rocks and place them outside of the cloner so you can place them exactly where you want them to. Now we have a 3D model that looks pretty good, and we can start finishing things up with the light and textures. First off, let's press Ctrl or Command and D to open the project settings, and down here you set the default object color to 80% gray, so we can have a better view when testing our lighting setup. It will basically get us close to one of those colorless clay renders you see a lot. Next up, a first thing to do is going in the render settings and adding an ambient occlusion effect. This will give us a more realistic shading, but to take full effect of this, we need to add lights to cast the shadows. Let's start off with an area light and roughly scale it up to the size of the tree, and then move it to the left side where we can rotate and angle it into position. Also make sure to go in the light settings and add an area shadow, and it's probably a good idea to give the light a warm but soft color, something orange. When we render this, you can see adding the light in this position gives us some dramatic long shadows at the right side of the objects, which makes things look more interesting in my opinion. Next up, let's duplicate this area light and make it smaller and position it somewhere at the right side of the tree, but also somewhat behind it. This will be our edge light, which optically separates the tree from the background. And for this one we can disable the shadows, because it will look strange having shadows coming from two different directions. And also set the color to something more bluish. By having this orange and blue light coming from two different directions, we are basically applying lighting techniques used in photography studios and on theater stages. Originally they started doing this because white light didn't exist. It had to be created by adding multiple colors of light which mixed into a white light. Obviously we don't need to worry about that here, but we are just using this because it gives us a nice contrast, which might remind you of a nice sunset where you have the combination of warm light from the sun and cold light bouncing off the moon. But when we render this again, there are still many parts which are completely dark right now. So create a new area light and adjust it so it becomes one big overhead light floating above the tree. This one can stay almost white, and we are going to give it some shadows as well. When we render, you can see we are getting some of our details back again, but the overall scene is still pretty dark. A great way to light up your scene without cranking up the brightness of your lights and overexposing the whole shot is adding what we call a global light. Basically, this is a regular Omni light where we check the ambient illumination option. This means it will light up the whole scene regardless of its position. Now you can control the brightness with the intensity slider, and let's keep it somewhere around 80% for now. When we render this, you can see everything receives enough light right now. Also, something I would like to point out is how the shadows behave depending on where you place your lights. When the light is close to your object, the shadows get larger and softer, and when we move it further away, the shadows get darker and sharper. In the render you can see everything is nicely lit right now, but the background is still black. And we want this infinite floor look, so a first step to do this is adding a background. And let's move the floor object closer to the background object in the hierarchy, so we can see what we are doing. And now create a new material down here by double clicking. And you can just leave the settings at default right now, so close this window. And then apply this material to both the floor and the background. And when we render this, you would expect it to be smoothly merging into each other, but it doesn't. To fix this, you need to right click on the floor and go into Cinema 4D tags and select the Compositing tag. Now simply check the Compositing background option and you're done. So now when we render, you can see it works fine, but the shadows down here on the floor are a little bit too much for my liking, and this is because the light is too far away. So if we move it further away, it gets even worse, but we want it really close to the tree, so it gets really soft. But we can adjust this later on. But first we are going to set up a nice composition for our camera. And we can do this by creating a camera and checking this black square so it turns white. And this means you're currently viewing through the camera lens. And now we are going to apply a trick that turns everything in something that looks like a miniature object. And this can be done by setting the focal length to something like 200. What this does is zooming in so much that the perspective gets straightened out. And now let's also reposition this view so the tree is nicely centered. And when you're satisfied, it's a good idea to lock the view so you don't accidentally ruin it by moving the camera. To do this, you need to right click on the camera and go into Cinema 4D tags again. And there you can find the protection tag, and this means you can't edit the object, you can't move it around. It stays there exactly like you left it. Now as a final step, it's a good idea to add some colors. Our first material will be the tree crowns. Give it some bright green color with a hint of yellow in it maybe. And down here we are going to add a texture to it, which will be a gradient in this case. When you've done that, click on the gradient image and set the type to 2D circular. And up here we want to right click on this gradient and invert the knots so it gets darker around the edges and bright in the center. Also replace the black with some medium gray so it isn't as harsh. When we go back to our color settings, reduce the mix strength a lot, so something about 10% would work, because we only need a little hint of it. And now after we applied the material to the objects, you can see the center of every polygon is slightly brighter than the edges. And this is a good technique to use on low poly objects that are kind of round, because the edges usually don't look as crisp on these. Next up, let's create a new material for our grass. This will be a darker green. Apply it to some of our pyramids in the cloner, but also create a new material with a different shade of green for the remaining pyramids, so we get a little bit of variation. For the rocks, let's choose a grayish color with a hint of orange in it. And you can also create a second material again for the other rocks. Our final texture will be the trunk, which will be brown of course. And down here add a new texture again, but this time we are going to pick noise. We can already decrease the mix strength again to 10% and then click on the noise image. To change the type of noise, you need to click this tiny arrow right here, and it isn't the most obvious thing, so try remembering this one. And for our trunk, a nice texture would be the pezzo one right here. After that you can close the window now and apply it to your trunk. Alright, so that is basically it for our modeling portion of this tutorial. Obviously you can keep adjusting everything until it looks great, don't be afraid to experiment with it. And as a reference, most of the times 50% of my time goes into adjusting and experimenting with the lights, colors, textures and so on. So don't be afraid to do this. Alright, our first step is adding our two key components that will create the animation, which are the bend and the twist object. Make sure your tree is grouped together already and place it together with the bend and twist object into a new group. Now with both the bend and twist objects selected, let's adjust the size so it roughly fits around the tree. But one thing to pay attention to is that the bottom of these are kind of lined up with the bottom of our tree. Great. When that is done, we can start playing around with the values. And let's take a look what happens when we increase the strength of our bend object. As expected, it bends, but in an expressive and funny way, and that's not exactly what we are looking for. So check this keep y-axis length option, and that will prevent the tree from stretching in this unrealistic manner. The twist object also does what you would expect it to do, and it seems to work perfectly fine. So to start animating these, go back to our bend object and set the strength to something like -5 degrees and the angle to something like 36 degrees. In order to keyframe those values, we need to hold Ctrl or Command and click the circle next to each value, so it turns red. Next up, let's move the playhead to 60 frames, which will be at the middle of our animation. That will be 120 frames in total. And change the values to 5 and 17 degrees and create new keyframes again. Next up, let's go to our twist object and make sure the playhead is on frame 0 again, and also set it to -5 degrees and create a new keyframe. Now move the playhead to 60 frames again and change the value to 8 degrees. It is a good idea to not pick exactly 5 degrees again, because it would make the animation look too symmetrical and artificial. Also, if your timeline only goes up to 90 frames, you can enter the 120 frames down here and make sure this preview area reaches all the way to the end. So now when we play this, we can see the animation, but it doesn't repeat itself seamlessly like we intended to. To get a better view of our animations, let's go up here to Window and select the Timeline F-curve. Right now this looks clean because we have just one simple animation, but in larger projects it can get very overwhelming. To make our animation repeat, click on one of those objects at the left here, and you will see a menu pops up in the background. Now when we set the before and after to oscillate, it will automatically repeat the animation in reverse. And also next to the after option, make sure to set the repetitions to a very large number like this, so it infinitely repeats itself. Now also do the same thing with the other object and you'll see the curves smoothly repeat themselves up here. So when we close this and play the animation again, you can see it loops nicely and the animation is basically done.